William Wells Brown paints a grotesque picture of slavery prior to the American Civil War. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today I want to talk about a book that I read, one that is about slavery and racism in America at large. I am referring to Clotel, or The President's Daughter, by William Wells Brown, which was published in 1853. For those who don't know, William Wells Brown was a black American who lived in the United States in the 1800s. He was a former slave who was born into the system, managed to escape with his mother, but was caught, and then managed to escape again once they were unfortunately separated. And after he got free, he wrote a couple of pamphlets, some books, and what's interesting is he wrote this book, but there's like several different endings that he wrote over time as the face of slavery changed. For the sake of this of today's video, I'll be talking about the original ending that's included with the book rather than any of the other endings. Although you could probably do videos on those, and who knows what you could analyze from all that. But it's worth just talking about this specific ending for today. Unfortunately, William was harassed by slave catchers since he was a fugitive, even in the North, and so he had to leave for Europe, where he went on a peace tour and sort of talked to the Europeans about slavery in America. So pretty interesting life, and an author and also a book that I'm talking about because it is Black History Month. Very important to talk about all aspects of Black history, including slavery, which a lot of modern presidents, Donald Trump included, want to sort of minimize the presence of in America, even though the United States was kind of founded on the idea of slavery. It's built into the Constitution itself, and even though it was later abolished, it still kind of pervades American society because we've never really had a conversation about it. And so there's a lot worth talking about with this book. But without further ado, let's talk about Clotel. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So my copy, which was a Penguins Classic, which I got from my local library, don't forget to patronize your local library, it actually starts with a sort of biography of William Wells Brown, his own biography that he got published, just talking about his upbringing, which is relevant to this story, and his life as a slave. But the story primarily focuses on Clotel. She is a mixed-raced woman, referred to as a mulatto or a quadroon in this story. She is, at the start of the story, she's being sold, but it's revealed that she is the daughter or the granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson, which is pretty significant, playing on a rumor that was talked about at the time, but until recently it wasn't really confirmed. She's the daughter of Thomas Jefferson. He didn't free his slaves after he died. But at the start of the story, she's sold at an auction by a lecherous man named Horatio Green, who plans to use her as a sort of mistress. Because she is lighter skinned, that is deemed attractive by these men. So it's a form of slavery and prostitution, sex trafficking, if you will. And as the story progresses, we see that runaway slaves are burned at the stake. There's lynchings that take place in the South, in places like Natchez and New Orleans. We see that Clotel was separated from her sister and her mother, and so her mother was sold to a Reverend Peck, who was preaching to the slaves. His friend Carlton and his daughter Georgiana do not like the fact that the preacher is using the Bible to subjugate these slaves and isn't really talking about any other aspects of the Bible. But the Reverend doesn't seem willing to change how he perceives slavery. We see that Horatio's wife kind of catches on that he has a mistress, and so he ends this romance with Clotel, but doesn't do anything with her at first. Meanwhile, Althesa, who is Clotel's sister, gets married to a man in New Orleans who is white. It seems to be a marriage based on love, but he doesn't free her at any point, even though she kind of requests that sort of thing happen. And they end up having 2 kids from this relationship that forms. Horatio's wife pressures him to sell Clotel, but in an effort to punish Horatio, his wife separates Clotel from her daughter, Mary, who she had with Horatio. And Mary is made to be a live-in sort of servant as a punishment to Horatio, which is awful. And Clotel doesn't really see her throughout much of the rest of this story. The Reverend Peck ends up dying, and the slaves are passed down to, are said to be passed down to his other son. But Georgiana marries Carleton, and she ends up getting control of the slaves, and she sets up a system where the slaves can basically work for their freedom. Once they earn enough money, they're free to go. The slaves are happy, and they begin to work harder, which earns their sort of plantation the envy of the area. And when they tell them, what system they put in place, the other white landowners are upset and angry about it because slaves shouldn't be free at all in their eyes. Unfortunately, Clotel's mother isn't able to partake in this freedom offer because she dies shortly before she earns enough money, which is sad. And Clotel at this point is kind of enslaved, but she finds an opportunity to flee to the north, and she wants to find her daughter at this point. So she goes there, and we see that Georgiana at the same time frees the slaves before her death because she isn't sure whether Carleton will actually do so, so she lets the slaves go. A rare instance of generosity in this story, although I wouldn't call it generosity if you're freeing slaves. It's more like your moral obligation, but a rare instance of someone following that moral obligation. And then we see that a plague has hit New Orleans, yellow fever or something like that, and Althesa and her husband die. And because she was a slave and her children are black, those children are to be sold into slavery. One of them kills himself rather than be used in a prostitutional sense, and the other one is sold as a mistress as well. Her beloved, another slave, tries to rescue her, but he's shot by the man who bought her, and she dies of a broken heart a short while later. So Althesa and her family did not have a good outcome there. And then eventually Clotel manages to make it to Richmond in disguised as a man. Unfortunately, there was a recent uprising in the area, and all the slaves, everyone is just being held with suspicion. The police kind of barge into her hotel room, and they arrest her once they figure out that she is in fact a slave. And rather than sort of be sold back into slavery, she tries to escape from her jail while her master is coming to get her. But she's sort of trapped, and she reacts by jumping into the Potomac River, which kills her, unfortunately. Something you'll probably hear me say a lot of in this story, unfortunately. The word unfortunately. The story then focuses on Mary, who develops a relationship with another slave, a slave of Horatio's named George, and Mary helps George escape because she loves him. He was sentenced to die for his partaking in an uprising. And George manages to make it to England, and we find out that Mary had a hard life, but she also eventually makes it to England through escape and through managing to get her freedom. And they are presumably married at that point. This has a bit of a happy ending. However, there are other endings, as I mentioned before. It's worth for you to check those out if you were to purchase this kind of copy, or just look it up once you finish the story to better understand what kind of endings that Brown came up with. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with Clotel, or the President's Daughter. One of the main themes that William Wells Brown is getting at is the grotesque institution of slavery. Brown does not shy away from illustrating the evils of slavery. He puts it right there on the page, sometimes to the detriment of the story because it comes off more as preaching than actually telling a story. He kind of just stops the story to just go on a philosophical rant, which is probably necessary, but it does kind of hold up the story a little bit. But through these evils that you see in the story are the prostitution for women. Like these women are exclusively, these black women, these mulatto light-skinned women are being exclusively used as mistresses for these rich white men, these degenerates of society. It seems like these women have no choice in the matter. They're forced to have children. It's not really consensual. What's happening to them is sexual assault. It's rape. It's their bodily autonomy is being taken away twofold in this story. And then you see lynchings and whippings happen, like if slaves try to escape, they're made examples of so that other slaves won't try the same thing. Although that doesn't really help in some cases. In fact, it kind of inspires more people to try to escape or do uprisings and kill the people who claim to own them. And then, if a slave does manage to escape, there's the kidnapping aspect of it, not letting them leave. And even if they're in the safe north, you have these slave catchers who go out and try to catch them at every turn. Kind of highlighting that there's really no safe place in America at this time for a black individual. Even if they claim to have their freedom, that can be taken away because the laws are built against them. And there's also the use of religion in this story to subjugate, even though religion is supposed to be based on faith. And there's a lot of sections of the Bible that say, hey, religion is, or slavery is wrong, hurting your fellow man is wrong. The reverend in this story chooses to use the Bible in a way that confirms his own beliefs, but also tells the slaves that you have to obey your master, you have to obey God. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. Lastly, you should serve your masters faithfully because of their goodness to you. See to what trouble they have been on your account. Your fathers were poor, ignorant, and barbarous creatures in Africa, and the whites fitted our ships at great trouble and expense and brought you from that benighted land to Christian America, where you can sit under your own vine and fig tree and no one molest or make you afraid. Oh, my dear black brothers and sisters, you are indeed a fortunate and blessed people, which is a weird thing to say to people that you've enslaved. Oh, you're fortunate to be enslaved. And what really strikes me is here is like the reverend's like, oh, you should be grateful because your people were barbarous, your people were uncivilized, and we went there and we enslaved you, we provided you with a better life. But did they? No, the answer is no, they absolutely did not. But here they're using religion to sort of convince you that you should obey your masters, that this is God's will for you to be enslaved. Really using any and every avenue to try to convince these people that this is how things should be. And that's what's going on in the South. But things aren't much better in the North because there's Jim Crow laws in the North. Blacks might be free. There might be people who are against slavery in the North, but that doesn't mean those people want them as neighbors. That doesn't mean that those people believe that they should have the same rights. And so even those people might be morally righteous in some ways, it's clear that they still have every bit as bad deficits. Brown is not happy with the way that the Northerners treat black individuals. So essentially, he's painting a picture of a culture of racial violence and hate, a culture that hates black individuals, people who were born in this country, even though you say your parents came from Africa or something like that. By the 1850s, I think the slave trade had been kind of neutralized, and most of the slaves were already being born in America. So these people didn't really have a connection to Africa anymore. But you're still promoting that culture of racial violence, that these people should be grateful that they're enslaved. And it's suggesting a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of hate. And, the ultimate question is, why would you treat people like this? Is it right to treat people like this? And the answer is definitely no. Which, William Brown was not the first person to necessarily say that slavery was like this and was bad, and he definitely wasn't the last. But given the time period that he was saying this, at a time when it needed to be said, at a time when the country was being torn apart by this, I'm willing to give him a lot of credit for how well he's writing about this, and how it definitely shows that not everybody at the time was like slavery is good, and that it was an accident of its time. No, people pretty much knew that it was wrong, and that anybody who chose to continue it anyway was kind of a bad person. As I had mentioned, William Wells Brown is also talking about hypocrisy in this story. Slavery seems to be existing while America, props up beliefs of liberty and democracy and equality. It's written into the Declaration of Independence. It's written into the Constitution. In the Declaration of Independence, you have fighting against tyranny. You have America declaring that it is above dictators, above kings, and all sorts of things like that. And in the Constitution, it's talking about laws that are for equal and for everyone. But if that's the case, why is there slavery? Why do only some people actually have rights in this system? Women don't really have rights. They're treated better than slaves, but things aren't going well for them. And I think at this time, a lot of the people who could vote were white, wealthy landowners. Not everyone had equal rights in this society. But that was especially the case for Black Americans who were born into slavery. Like, they were as American as anyone else, and their rights were taken away. And when they pointed this out, the response was usually, well, it's religious. This is God's will, or it was, these Africans can't be trusted with their own society, or just like other sorts of excuses for why these people shouldn't have rights, which is a horrible logic, and it just makes you a horrible person. But I did touch upon that religious discrepancy, which I think is important in this story. The Reverend, talks about how God, wills this, but as the slaves point out in the story, they don't like hearing the Reverend talk about the Bible, because he only talks about one specific part of the Bible. He doesn't talk about any other part of the Bible, because some of them have been around the country. They know about the other parts of the Bible. But the Reverend only chooses to talk about the obedience part of it, rather than the other beautiful stories that talk about faith and support of a higher being or something like that. This discrepancy kind of highlights the hypocrisy of the Reverend, that you're supposed to love God and treat everyone equally in God's eyes, but they're not doing that to slaves. And again, only some people are allowed to be treated equally in the eyes of God, according to the Reverend, which just goes to further show the hypocrisy. Now, no one's going to actually acknowledge their own hypocrisy. It's the Reverend in this story, when he's called out, he's just like, this is just what I believe, which is how a lot of people sort of handle things in the modern world. Things haven't really changed. If you approach a Trump supporter or someone like that and say, your beliefs are causing harm to other people, and this is also how your beliefs are wrong, how they're not founded in science, they'll be like, well, I just believe this with my heart. Some people are unwilling to accept evidence that proves them wrong, unfortunately. But this hypocrisy is made even more apparent by the fact that the main character, Clotel, or one of the essential characters of the story, is the daughter of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Constitution and was like, all men are created equal and we're imbibed by our Creator to some higher power, and things are great like that. Jefferson also wrote into the Constitution that slavery was perfectly fine. How can you write about both of those things at once? How can you, sexually assault or pretty much rape a Black woman and then allow your kids to be sold into slavery? There has to be something wrong with this kind of person. And what's more, He notes that this is kind of the case for all the founding fathers. Wells is not willing to shy away from the fact that the founding fathers pretty much condoned this system of grotesque slavery, of violence towards people, people who were most likely definitely equal before the eyes of God, or who just deserved equal rights. Nobody deserves to be enslaved or punished or treated like garbage, and yet the founding fathers condoned this system. They purposely, tweaked the Constitution so you couldn't fight against this for like 30 years. And by then it was already too late. It was so enmeshed in America, at least in the South, that it led to the Civil War, which, Brown doesn't talk about here because that's before his time. But he clearly notes that, something's got to give. And it's either going to result in the death of plantation owners at the hands of slaves, or it's going to, require a great, Herculean effort on the part of congressmen, which he doesn't really see ever happening. But how can we say that these men are good if they're also deeply hypocritical, is the essential point that Brown is trying to make. And I think it's very brave of him, especially during this time while people were still high on the founding fathers, to be so critical of them. Another interesting element of this story is the internalized racism that exists for the slaves. The slaves kind of just pass on the hate that's dealt towards them, and they deliver it to other slaves, whether they know about it or not. Slaves of certain positions are treated better, and so they're vested the authority to kind of rule over the other slaves, and whether they're intending to do that or not, maybe it's an act of survival. There's a lot that could be said there. They kind of lord that power over and treat other slaves pretty harshly. A character in the story named Sam is kind of the house leader, the house slave, as you would say, kind of guiding purchases and keeping track of slaves and making sure all the work gets done on the behalf of his master. And he kind of views the other slaves pretty negatively in this story, and even talks about those slaves getting beat if they do something wrong. So the master is kind of pushing him to do bad things. There's a lot that can be said with the about the nature of the house slave and the sort of authority conflict that it brings and other things like that. I won't talk about that here. I'll just note that that's a form of internalized racism. And there's also colorism in this story, as you have light-skinned blacks versus dark-skinned blacks, and the light-skinned blacks are often used, especially the women, in a prostitutional sense, treated well by the masters, whereas the dark-skinned blacks see that, don't like it, and they in fact they aspire to make Clotel and her family have a miserable life. Now they probably don't realize that they're participating in this internalized racism. Again, it's probably an act of survival and just dealing with your own internal frustrations, but that colorism is there, and it seems to have continued long after slavery ended, because you see that kind of colorism in black society in many aspects. Many sociologists and other people have noted that before. But Brown specifically notes that that's not really helpful, as internalized racism prevents you from seeing the actual problem, which is the masters. Brown pretty much says that you got to be united and rise up against your oppressor. Even if it might result in your death, you got to be brave in that way to fight against this vile, corrupt institution of slavery. So it's pretty good that he's talking about this sort of united front, and which I would presume even you got to be united with the abolitionists. This has to be a multi-front kind of problem or solution, so that you can overcome these people who want to preserve slavery. I think an important question to ask about this story is, who is the intended audience? Because, he pretty much condemns slavery in this story. You have to wonder, is it Southerners? Is he trying to convince Southerners that slavery is wrong? I think with all I said before about how, religious people in particular didn't want to admit that they were wrong, I don't think it's the South. Wells has pretty much given up on the South at this point, and is merely trying to point out that these are vile, terrible people who promote an unjust system. Their minds are never going to change. Now, he could be talking a little bit to the Northerners, but he also acknowledges that these people are terrible because even if they allow slaves to be free, they don't want them on an equal standing with them. There are Jim Crow laws and other problems, so I don't think he's talking to them. Rather, I think he's talking to Europeans in this story. He's trying to highlight the institution of slavery in America because it seems a little bit unique in this time period, as I don't think many countries like the United Kingdom were still doing slavery, even though they were doing terrible things with imperialism. But I think Brown is trying to convince these people that slavery is wrong and gain allies in the cause, which would be important years later during the Civil War when the North was trying to dissuade Europe from entering the war on the part of the South. Lincoln pretty much assured that by doing the Emancipation Proclamation and making the war specifically about slavery. It was always about slavery, but with the Emancipation Proclamation, it just wrote it out and said it. You said the quiet part out loud, or something like that. So it's very interesting to see that audience and the historical implications of all of that. I do think the story is bold in its setup, especially calling out Thomas Jefferson, as I've noted before, and the writing is very passionate. William Wells Brown was a slave, so of course he wouldn't like slavery, but you can really tell that, and I think that passion is good in that it draws more eyes to the story, especially at the time. We're not in that time period of the antebellum America before the American Civil War. It's kind of long since passed, but I can get in the mindset by reading the story of someone who definitely wants this institution to end. There are a couple of problems with this story. I don't think there's much of a plot. There's a story about Clotel and her journey, but it feels like Wells is more interested in sort of sermonizing, sort of delivering a passionate plea, writing a pamphlet, which he turned into a longer form book. Because Clotel's story is interrupted by him talking about random occurrences that happened to other slaves, his own life, and just sort of delivering these passionate speeches about the philosophy of slavery, which is interesting, but it kind of interrupts the plot, and the story about Clotel doesn't really focus so much on Clotel or her family. It's kind of vague at times, but when he does talk about Clotel, it is interesting. I will give him that. And similar to what I just said, like it doesn't really follow any specific character. People keep dying in the story, which is a problem of slavery. But given that it's called Clotel, you think there would be a stronger focus on Clotel rather than jumping from character to character and watching them all die. It is rather bleak in that regard. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on Clotel, or The President's Daughter by William Wells Brown. A very solid book. One that is very infuriating seeing a former slave talk about all the terrible things that happened to him, being sort of angry about that and realizing it's a righteous anger. His anger was righteous too. It can be hard to get into. Again, there's not much plot to speak of, but I do think it's a worthy read, especially in Black History Month and especially outside of Black History Month. So I strongly recommend that you go seek it out, maybe at your local library, as I found this one at my local library, as I mentioned before. If you have anything to say, let me know in the comments below. If you just want to comment on my review, I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. Otherwise, join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about books, movies, TV. There's a link to that in the description. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and slave-fighting abolitionist travels. Farewell.